The hardest part about losing someone isn't the goodbye. Marcus Johnson once heard a nurse whisper in a hospital hallway. It's waking up the next morning and remembering they're still gone. At 11:47 p.m., Marcus sat alone in a vinyl chair outside room 314 at St. Matthew's Medical Center in Charlotte, North Carolina. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a pale glow across the polished floor, turning everything cold and colorless. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee, the kind that had been sitting on a warmer for too many hours. Around him, the hospital moved in quiet rhythms. A distant cart rattled down a hallway. Soft voices drifted from the nurse's station. Somewhere behind a closed door, a monitor released a steady electronic pulse that seemed to measure time itself. Marcus stared at the simple silver ring resting in his palm. It caught the light every few seconds as he turned it slowly between his fingers. He had carried that ring for almost 3 months. 3 months of waiting for the right moment. 3 months of imagining a future that suddenly felt fragile. He closed his hand around it and lowered his head. Beyond the door in front of him was the woman who had changed everything. The woman who had taught him that kindness was not weakness. The woman who had shown him that even a broken heart could learn to trust again. The woman who had become home. And now, for the first time in years, Marcus was afraid. Not the kind of fear that came from unpaid bills or uncertain jobs. Not the fear of being judged or overlooked. He had known those fears his entire life. This was different. This was the fear of losing the last person who truly saw him. A nurse stepped quietly from the room and offered a small, reassuring smile. Marcus stood immediately, hope flashing through him before he could stop it. "Any change?" he asked softly. The nurse hesitated for half a second before gently shaking her head. "Not yet, Mr. Johnson. But she's stable." Stable. It was a word he had heard dozens of times that day. A word that sounded comforting until you realized it didn't answer the question that mattered most. Marcus thanked her and sat back down. His shoulders felt heavier than they had that morning. Outside the large window at the end of the corridor, rain tapped softly against the glass. The city lights shimmered through the droplets, blurred into streaks of gold and white. Charlotte continued moving beyond those walls. Cars traveled down wet streets. Restaurants closed their doors. Families gathered around televisions and kitchen tables. Life continued as if nothing had happened. But for Marcus, the world had narrowed to a single hospital room. He leaned back and closed his eyes. The exhaustion settled into his bones like winter cold. 24 hours earlier, everything had felt normal. 24 hours earlier, he had been laughing, planning, dreaming, certain that the future was finally beginning to make sense. Now every plan seemed suspended in silence. Every dream waited behind that closed door. He rubbed his thumb against the ring again and felt an old memory rise to the surface. Memories had a strange way of arriving when people felt alone. They slipped through cracks in the present and carried you backward before you even noticed. Marcus thought about all the people he had already lost. Faces he still remembered. Voices he could almost hear if he concentrated hard enough. There had been moments in his life when grief felt endless. Moments when he believed hope had quietly left the room for good. Yet somehow he had kept moving forward. One day at a time. One small act of kindness at a time. He opened his eyes and stared at the closed door again. Behind it was the reason he still believed tomorrow could be better than today. The reason he had learned to trust happiness without waiting for it to disappear. The reason he carried that silver ring in his pocket. Marcus took a slow breath and listened to the rain against the window. He didn't know what the next few hours would bring. He didn't know whether his future was waiting behind that door or slipping quietly beyond his reach. But as midnight approached and the hospital settled into deeper silence, one thing became painfully clear. To understand why Marcus sat there holding a ring he had never given, you first had to understand the boy everyone else had forgotten. Long before he sat beneath the cold hospital lights clutching a silver ring, Marcus Johnson was the kind of boy most people never noticed. He grew up in a small neighborhood outside Augusta, Georgia, where the summer air hung heavy with humidity and the sound of cicadas drifted through open windows long after sunset. The streets were lined with modest homes, their paint faded by years of sun and rain, and nearly everyone knew everyone else's name. Marcus lived in a narrow one-story house with his parents, David and Lorraine Johnson. The house was small, but his mother always found ways to make it feel warm. The smell of cornbread often filled the kitchen. Family photographs covered the walls. A worn blue blanket rested across the living room couch, no matter the season. It was not much by most standards, but to Marcus it felt like the center of the world. As a child, Marcus rarely demanded attention. While other boys competed to be the loudest in the room, he often sat quietly observing. He listened more than he spoke. He noticed things other people missed. The elderly neighbor struggling to carry groceries. The lonely student eating lunch alone. The tired cashier forcing a smile after a long shift. Even at 8 years old, Marcus seemed to understand that everyone carried burdens nobody else could see. His mother noticed it first. "You have a soft heart," Lorraine would tell him while folding laundry at the kitchen table. "Do not let anybody convince you that is a weakness." Marcus never forgot those words. Every morning before sunrise, David Johnson left for work at a manufacturing plant nearly 20 miles away. He would drink coffee from the same chipped mug and quietly kiss Lorraine on the forehead before heading out the door. Marcus admired his father. David was not a man of grand speeches. He taught through example. He held doors open for strangers. He helped neighbors repair fences. He treated every person with respect, whether they wore a business suit or work boots. On weekends, Marcus followed him everywhere. Together they mowed lawns for elderly residents, fixed squeaky porch steps, and delivered groceries to people who could not drive. David never asked for payment. When Marcus questioned why, his father would simply smile and say, "Because one day we will need help too." Those lessons settled deep inside Marcus. By the time he reached middle school, he had developed a reputation for being dependable. Teachers trusted him. Neighbors greeted him warmly. Yet despite his kindness, Marcus often felt invisible. He was not the star athlete. He was not the funniest kid in class. He was not the student who attracted attention. He was simply Marcus, the boy who showed up, the boy who listened, the boy who helped clean up after everyone else had already gone home. Sometimes that invisibility hurt more than he admitted. On Friday nights, he would sit on the front porch watching groups of friends laugh as they walked down the street. He wondered what it felt like to be the person everyone noticed when entering a room. He wondered whether anyone truly saw him beyond his kindness. But each time those thoughts surfaced, his mother had a way of pulling him back. One evening, as golden sunlight stretched across the yard, Lorraine sat beside him on the porch swing. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass. "You are quiet tonight," she said. Marcus shrugged. "Sometimes I feel like nobody remembers I am there." Lorraine smiled softly. "The world remembers loud people first, but it remembers kind people longest." Marcus looked out toward the road as her words settled into the evening air. At the time, he did not fully understand what she meant. He was still young enough to believe life followed simple rules. Work hard. Be kind. Do the right thing. Everything will eventually make sense. He had no way of knowing that the years ahead would challenge every one of those beliefs. He had no idea how much loss could fit into a single life. And he certainly did not know that the quiet lessons learned on that porch would become the foundation he would cling to when everything else began to fall apart. The first crack in Marcus Johnson's world appeared on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The sky above Augusta was bright and clear, and the late spring air carried the scent of blooming magnolias drifting through the neighborhood. Marcus was 15 years old, sitting in algebra class, staring at a page filled with numbers that suddenly seemed impossible to focus on. A school secretary appeared at the classroom door and quietly spoke to his teacher. A moment later, Marcus was asked to gather his things and report to the front office. At first he thought he had done something wrong. He replayed the day in his mind as he walked down the hallway, listening to the echo of his sneakers against the polished floor. When he reached the office, he saw his mother waiting beside the receptionist's desk. Lorraine Johnson was trying to smile, but her eyes told a different story. They drove home mostly in silence. The familiar roads felt strangely unfamiliar that afternoon. Every traffic light seemed to last longer than usual. Every mile felt heavier. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Marcus noticed several cars already parked outside the house. Friends from church, neighbors, people his family knew. His stomach tightened before anyone even spoke a word. Inside, the living room felt crowded and unusually quiet at the same time. Conversations were reduced to whispers. Coffee cups sat untouched on side tables. Some people looked away when Marcus entered. Others offered gentle nods filled with sympathy. It was then that he learned his father had suffered a serious medical emergency at work. The details seemed distant and blurred. All Marcus truly understood was that life had suddenly changed direction. The days that followed moved like slow motion. Hospital visits replaced ordinary routines. School assignments piled up untouched on the kitchen table. The clock in the hallway continued ticking, but time no longer felt normal. Marcus spent long hours sitting beside his father's bed, listening to the soft hum of machines and the quiet voices of nurses moving through the corridors. David Johnson remained calm, even during difficult moments. One evening, as the setting sun painted golden stripes across the hospital room, he motioned for Marcus to move his chair closer. His voice was weaker than Marcus had ever heard, yet the kindness remained unchanged. "Take care of your mother," David said softly. Marcus immediately shook his head. "You are coming home. We are all going home." His father smiled, but there was sadness behind it. "Promise me anyway." Marcus lowered his eyes and nodded. It was the hardest promise he had ever made. Weeks later, the house that had always felt warm suddenly felt enormous. Every room seemed quieter. Every familiar object carried memories that appeared when least expected. David's coffee mug remained in the cabinet. His work boots still sat near the back door. His favorite chair remained exactly where he had left it. Marcus would sometimes catch himself expecting to hear the sound of his father's truck pulling into the driveway after work. Then reality would settle over him again. Grief arrived in strange ways. Sometimes it came as silence. Sometimes it arrived through ordinary moments. A song on the radio, a familiar scent, a memory triggered by nothing at all. Lorraine tried to stay strong, but Marcus could see the exhaustion growing behind her eyes. She worked longer hours to keep the household running. Bills appeared more frequently. Stress quietly settled into every corner of their lives. For the first time, Marcus began to understand how fragile stability could be. The future he once assumed was guaranteed suddenly looked uncertain. College felt farther away. Dreams seemed less important than responsibilities. Yet despite the weight pressing down on him, Marcus remembered his promise. He started helping more around the house. He worked part-time after school. He gave up weekends with friends when extra shifts were available. Each small sacrifice felt necessary. Each choice felt like a way of honoring the man who had spent his entire life serving others. One evening, nearly a year after his father's passing, Marcus stood alone on the front porch as the sun disappeared beyond the trees. The air was cool, and a gentle breeze stirred the wind chimes hanging near the door. He looked across the quiet neighborhood and realized something unsettling. The pain had not disappeared. It had simply become part of him. He was learning how to carry it. What Marcus did not realize was that this loss, as painful as it felt, was only the beginning. Life had already started preparing another test, one that would challenge everything his father and mother had taught him about hope. The years that followed changed Marcus Johnson in ways nobody immediately noticed. By the time he graduated from high school, the easy certainty of childhood had been replaced by a quiet sense of responsibility that seemed far older than his age. While many of his classmates talked excitedly about moving away, joining fraternities, or chasing adventures across the country, Marcus stayed close to home. He enrolled at a local community college and worked evenings at a grocery store to help support his mother. The routine was exhausting. Most mornings began before sunrise. Most nights ended long after dark. Yet Marcus rarely complained. He had inherited too much of his father's character for that. The grocery store sat on the edge of town beside a busy highway. Every shift brought a steady stream of customers. Construction workers grabbing coffee before dawn. Parents hurrying through after work. Elderly residents who came as much for conversation as they did for groceries. Marcus learned people's names. He remembered birthdays. He carried bags to cars without being asked. It was never part of his job description, but kindness had become second nature. Over time, regular customers began choosing his checkout lane even when other lines were shorter. Some days a widow named Mrs. Henderson would stop by simply to tell him about her grandchildren. Other afternoons, an elderly veteran named Frank would share stories about fishing trips from decades earlier. Marcus listened to all of them, not because he needed to, because he genuinely cared. One rainy November evening, as cold drops tapped against the store windows, Marcus noticed a young mother standing near the register counting dollar bills with growing concern. Her shopping cart contained only a few essentials: bread, milk, diapers, a jar of peanut butter. The total came up several dollars higher than she expected. Embarrassment spread across her face as she quietly began removing items. Marcus looked at the small child sleeping in the cart and then at the exhausted woman. Without drawing attention, he reached into his own wallet and covered the difference. The woman looked stunned. "You did not have to do that," she said softly. Marcus simply smiled. Everybody needs a little help sometimes. By the time he walked home that night, the rain had soaked through his jacket. His feet were cold. His paycheck was already stretched thin, yet he felt lighter than he had all day. Lorraine noticed the smile when he came through the door. "What happened?" she asked. Marcus shrugged. "Nothing important." His mother laughed gently. "The people who help others always say that." Those moments became common. Marcus volunteered at food drives on weekends. He helped repair roofs after storms. He spent Saturday mornings delivering meals to seniors through a local church outreach program. None of it earned him recognition. There were no awards, no headlines. Most people never knew. Yet each act gave him a sense of purpose that money could not provide. Still, life remained complicated. Financial pressure never fully disappeared. Bills arrived with relentless consistency. Unexpected expenses seemed to appear whenever progress felt possible. Some nights Marcus lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering whether doing the right thing actually mattered. He watched less generous people move ahead more quickly. He saw selfishness rewarded and kindness overlooked. The questions lingered longer than he admitted. One evening after dinner, Lorraine found him sitting alone on the porch. The air was cool, and the distant sound of crickets filled the darkness. "You are carrying something," she said. Marcus looked down at his hands. "Do you ever wonder if being kind makes any difference?" Lorraine studied him for a moment before answering. "Kindness does not always change the world overnight. Sometimes it changes one person. Sometimes it changes 10. Sometimes it changes you." Marcus sat quietly as her words settled into the night air. Deep down, he wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe every sacrifice mattered. He wanted to believe goodness eventually found its way back home. At that moment, neither of them realized how little time they had left together, and neither could see the storm that was already beginning to gather just beyond the horizon. Winter arrived quietly that year. The mornings grew colder, and a thin layer of frost sometimes covered the grass outside the Johnson home before sunrise. Marcus noticed changes in his mother long before she admitted anything was wrong. Lorraine moved more slowly through the house. Tasks that once seemed effortless now left her tired. She smiled less often, though she tried hard to hide it. At first, Marcus blamed stress. They had both been carrying heavy burdens for years. But deep down, he sensed something else. One Sunday afternoon, sunlight filtered softly through the church windows as the congregation gathered after service. Lorraine sat beside him on a wooden bench near the entrance. Her smile appeared distant. Her skin seemed pale beneath the warm light. When she stood, she paused briefly as if gathering strength. Marcus immediately noticed. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked. Lorraine offered the same reassuring smile she had used throughout his entire life. "I am fine, baby. Just tired." But the tiredness did not go away. Weeks became months. Doctor appointments began appearing on the family calendar. More medications appeared in the kitchen cabinet. Some evenings Lorraine would sit quietly by the living room window, staring into the distance as twilight settled across the neighborhood. Marcus often joined her. Neither spoke much during those moments. Sometimes silence felt easier than questions. One rainy evening, the sound of water tapping against the roof filled the house. Marcus returned home from work carrying a bag of groceries. He found Lorraine sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold beside her. The room smelled faintly of cinnamon and rain. She looked up and smiled as he entered. "You work too hard," she said softly. Marcus set the groceries down and laughed. "I learned from the best." Lorraine lowered her eyes. For a moment, sadness passed across her face. "No," she whispered. "You learned to carry too much." Marcus wanted to argue, but something in her voice stopped him. The months that followed became a blur of responsibilities and worry. Hospital visits increased. Long conversations with doctors replaced ordinary evenings. Some days brought hope. Others brought uncertainty. Through it all, Marcus remained at her side. He drove her to appointments, cooked meals, managed bills, sat with her through difficult nights when sleep seemed impossible. Yet no amount of preparation can truly prepare someone for losing the person who taught them how to live. The morning it happened felt strangely ordinary. Sunlight streamed through the curtains. Birds chirped outside. The world continued exactly as it always had. Marcus remembered standing in the kitchen staring at a coffee mug while trying to understand why everything suddenly felt unreal. Friends arrived. Family members called. Neighbors brought casseroles and flowers. Voices filled the house. But all Marcus could hear was silence. Days later, after everyone returned to their own lives, the house felt emptier than he had ever imagined possible. Every room carried traces of Lorraine. Her favorite blanket rested neatly folded over the couch. Her reading glasses remained beside an unfinished book. A handwritten grocery list still hung on the refrigerator. Ordinary objects became impossible reminders. One night Marcus sat alone on the front porch where they had shared countless conversations over the years. The air was cool, and the neighborhood was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. Above him, stars filled the Georgia sky. For the first time in his life, he felt completely alone. Not lonely. Alone. The kind of emptiness that settles deep inside a person and refuses to leave. He thought about his father. He thought about his mother. He thought about every lesson they had spent years teaching him. Kindness, patience, faith, hope. Yet sitting there beneath the stars, those lessons felt harder to hold on to. Grief had a way of making the future seem smaller. The dreams Marcus once carried now felt distant. The purpose that once guided him seemed hidden behind a fog he could not see through. As midnight approached, a cold breeze moved through the trees and stirred the wind chimes hanging beside the porch. The soft notes drifted through the darkness like a familiar voice. Marcus closed his eyes and listened. He did not know it yet, but the lowest chapter of his life had finally arrived. And somewhere beyond that darkness, a person he had never met was already moving toward his story. The months after Lorraine's passing drifted by in a haze Marcus could barely remember. He continued working, continued paying bills, continued showing up wherever people needed help, but something inside him had gone quiet. The kindness remained, yet the joy behind it felt distant. Most evenings ended the same way. He would return to the small house, unlock the front door, and step into a silence that seemed larger than the rooms themselves. One Saturday morning in early spring, Marcus volunteered at a community book fair organized by a local elementary school in Charlotte, where he had recently relocated for better work opportunities. The air was cool and carried the scent of fresh coffee and newly cut grass. White tents lined the school playground, and families moved between tables stacked with donated books. Children laughed as they raced across the blacktop. Parents chatted beneath bright blue skies. Marcus spent most of the morning unloading boxes and helping elderly visitors carry purchases to their cars. It was the sort of event he normally would have enjoyed. Instead, he moved through it quietly, performing each task almost automatically. Around noon, while carrying a heavy box of children's books toward the library entrance, he heard a voice behind him. You know, most people would ask for help before trying to carry all of that themselves. The voice was warm, amused, and completely unexpected. Marcus turned and saw a woman standing beside the doorway. She appeared to be in her early 30s. Light brown hair rested neatly against her shoulders. A stack of reading worksheets was tucked beneath one arm. Her eyes held the kind of calm confidence that instantly made people feel comfortable. Marcus glanced down at the box and smiled faintly. I thought I had it under control. That is usually what people say 5 seconds before dropping something, she replied. To his surprise, he laughed. It was not a large laugh, not even a particularly loud one, but it was genuine, and it felt unfamiliar after so many months. The woman extended her hand. I am Amelia Carter, 3rd grade teacher. Marcus shifted the box slightly and shook her hand. Marcus Johnson. Volunteer? She asked. Something like that. Amelia nodded. You seem to be doing half the work around here. Marcus shrugged. Keeps me busy. The answer escaped before he could think about it. Amelia studied him for a brief moment. Not with judgment. Not with pity. Simply with curiosity. Sometimes staying busy is easier than slowing down, she said softly. Marcus looked at her, surprised by how accurately she had described his life. Before he could respond, a group of children rushed toward Amelia, excitedly waving books they wanted her to see. Her face immediately brightened. She crouched beside them, listened to every word, and celebrated their excitement as though each book were the greatest discovery in the world. Marcus found himself watching from a distance. There was something genuine about her, something unforced. Throughout the afternoon, their paths crossed several times. They exchanged small conversations between tasks. Favorite authors, childhood memories, the best local restaurants. Nothing particularly important. Yet each conversation felt unexpectedly easy. For the first time in years, Marcus did not feel invisible. Amelia listened when he spoke. She remembered details. She asked questions that went beyond polite small talk. As the event began winding down and the golden light of late afternoon stretched across the playground, volunteers started packing away tables and folding chairs. Marcus loaded the final box into a storage room and prepared to leave. He expected the day to end like any other. Instead, Amelia approached carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. She handed one to him with a small smile. For the volunteer who apparently thinks he can carry the entire event by himself. Marcus accepted the cup. The warmth spread through his hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the fair faded into the background. The breeze moved gently through the trees surrounding the school grounds. And somewhere deep inside, a place that grief had left cold for a very long time stirred ever so slightly back to life. The weeks following the book fair unfolded with a quiet steadiness Marcus had not experienced in years. What began as occasional conversations gradually became part of his routine. Some evenings he would meet Amelia at a small coffee shop near the school where she taught. Other days they would walk through a nearby park lined with oak trees whose branches stretched overhead like a living canopy. There was never any pressure between them. No grand gestures. No complicated expectations. Just 2 people learning how to share pieces of their lives one conversation at a time. Marcus found himself looking forward to those moments more than he wanted to admit. Amelia had a gift for making ordinary days feel meaningful. She noticed details others overlooked. She remembered stories he told weeks earlier. She asked questions that made him think rather than simply respond. Most importantly, she never treated his kindness as something unusual. To her, it was simply part of who he was. One Saturday morning, they volunteered together at a community garden on the edge of Charlotte. The spring sun warmed the earth, and rows of vegetables stretched across the property in neat lines. Children laughed as they watered plants with oversized green watering cans. Marcus spent the morning building raised garden beds while Amelia helped organize educational activities for local families. At lunchtime, they sat beneath a large maple tree sharing sandwiches and cold lemonade. A gentle breeze moved through the leaves above them, creating shifting patterns of light across the grass. Amelia glanced at him and smiled. "Do you realize you spend most of your free time helping other people?" Marcus laughed softly. "I never really thought about it. That is because it comes naturally to you." He looked down at his hands. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Marcus said something he rarely shared. "Sometimes I wonder if I am helping people because I genuinely want to, or because it keeps me from thinking too much." Amelia considered the question carefully. "Maybe it is both," she said. "But helping people does not become less meaningful just because it helps you heal too." Her words stayed with him long after that afternoon ended. As summer approached, their friendship deepened into something neither could fully define at first. They attended school fundraisers together, explored local bookstores, shared dinners at modest restaurants where conversations lasted longer than meals. Marcus slowly began telling her about his parents, about the lessons his father taught him, about the porch where he and his mother used to sit for hours discussing life. Amelia listened to every story with quiet attention. In return, she shared her own journey, the challenges of teaching, the disappointments she had faced, the dreams she still carried despite setbacks. One evening they sat on a bench overlooking a small lake just outside the city. The setting sun painted the water with shades of gold and orange. Ducks drifted lazily across the surface while distant voices echoed from a walking trail nearby. Marcus watched the reflection of sunlight shimmer across the water and realized something had changed. The grief he carried had not disappeared. He still missed his parents every day. There were still moments when loneliness appeared without warning. But for the first time in a very long time, those feelings no longer defined every part of his life. Amelia had not erased his pain. She had simply shown him that joy and grief could exist in the same heart. As twilight settled over the lake, she turned toward him. "You know what I like most about you?" she asked. Marcus smiled. "I'm almost afraid to ask. You never pretend to be someone else." He looked away, suddenly emotional for reasons he could not fully explain. All his life he had worried about being overlooked. about being ordinary, about fading into the background while others received attention. Yet sitting beside Amelia, none of those fears seemed to matter. For the first time, he felt completely seen. The evening air grew cooler as the last light slipped beyond the horizon. Marcus sat quietly beside her, listening to the gentle movement of water against the shore. Somewhere deep inside, a future he had stopped believing in was beginning to take shape. And for the first time since losing his parents, hope no longer felt like a memory. It felt like something real. For nearly 2 years, life seemed to reward the patience both Marcus and Amelia had shown through their struggles. The future they once spoke about cautiously became something they openly planned together. Weekends were no longer spent simply filling empty hours. They were spent building memories. Saturday mornings often began at a small diner with checkered floors and the smell of fresh pancakes drifting through the air. Sunday afternoons were reserved for long walks through Freedom Park, where they talked about everything from childhood memories to dreams they still hoped to achieve. Marcus had never imagined happiness could feel so steady. It was not dramatic. It was not perfect. It was simply real. One autumn evening, as golden leaves drifted across the sidewalk outside Amelia's apartment, they sat together on her balcony overlooking the city. The sun was setting behind the skyline, painting the clouds with shades of amber and pink. Amelia rested a warm mug of tea between her hands while Marcus watched the lights slowly appear across Charlotte. "Do you ever think about how different life looked a few years ago?" Amelia asked quietly. Marcus smiled. "Every day." She looked toward him, and he thought for a moment. "I think if my younger self could see this moment, he would not believe it." Amelia laughed softly. "Why not?" Marcus looked out toward the horizon. "Because for a long time, I thought happiness was something that happened to other people." The smile that crossed Amelia's face carried both tenderness and sadness. "I am glad you were wrong." As the months passed, their lives became increasingly intertwined. Amelia met the friends Marcus had made through volunteer work. Marcus attended school events where Amelia's students greeted her with excitement and admiration. They hosted small dinners, shared holidays, created traditions neither had expected to matter so much. Slowly, the emptiness left behind by years of loss began filling with something new. Hope no longer felt temporary. It felt permanent. Then came the ring. Marcus purchased it on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. The jewelry store sat on a quiet street downtown. Nothing about the moment felt cinematic. There were no dramatic speeches or life-changing revelations. Just a man standing beneath warm showroom lights, holding a simple silver ring and realizing he had found the person he wanted beside him for the rest of his life. He kept the ring hidden for weeks. Sometimes he would take it from the small box at night and imagine the moment he would finally ask the question. He planned everything carefully. The location, the timing, the words. Yet life has a way of ignoring even the most thoughtful plans. It happened on a rainy afternoon in late October. Dark clouds covered the city. Wind pushed sheets of rain against office windows and storefronts. Marcus had spent most of the day helping organize a community fundraiser and expected to meet Amelia later that evening. Around 4 o'clock, his phone rang. At first, he almost ignored it. He was carrying supplies across a parking lot and trying to stay dry beneath a jacket already soaked by rain. When he finally answered, the unfamiliar voice on the other end immediately made his stomach tighten. The conversation lasted less than a minute. By the time it ended, the world around him felt strangely distant. The sounds of traffic blurred together. The cold rain against his face barely registered. Marcus stood completely still, gripping the phone as people hurried past carrying umbrellas and briefcases. He heard only fragments. Hospital. Evaluation. Observation. Stable condition. More information to follow. Stable. The same word. The same terrible word he remembered hearing years earlier. Within minutes, he was driving through rain-slicked streets towards St. Matthew's Medical Center. Every red light felt unbearable. Every mile seemed longer than the last. His hands tightened around the steering wheel as memories he had spent years trying to heal suddenly rushed back without warning. By the time he entered the hospital lobby, his heart was racing. Bright fluorescent lights reflected across polished floors. Nurses moved quickly between hallways. Families sat waiting in silence. The familiar smell of antiseptic hung in the air. Marcus approached the reception desk and spoke Amelia's name. A few minutes later, he found himself standing outside room 314. The door remained closed. The hallway was quiet except for the distant hum of medical equipment. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and felt the small ring box still resting there. The future he had imagined that morning suddenly felt uncertain. And as rain continued tapping against the hospital windows beyond the corridor, Marcus lowered himself into a waiting room chair and prepared for the longest night of his life. The night seemed endless. Marcus remained outside room 314 as the hours slipped by one silent minute at a time. Nurses changed shifts. Hallway lights dimmed slightly. The rain eventually softened into a gentle drizzle that traced silver lines across the hospital windows. Still, he stayed in the same chair, the small ring box resting in his pocket like a promise waiting for permission to exist. Sometime after 3 in the morning, exhaustion finally settled over him. He leaned forward, clasped his hands together, and lowered his head. Around him, the hospital continued its quiet rhythm. Monitors beeped softly. Wheels rolled across polished floors. Voices drifted in and out of earshot. Yet for Marcus, the entire world had narrowed to one closed door. As dawn slowly approached, pale blue light began replacing the darkness outside. The city was waking up. Delivery trucks moved through wet streets. Coffee shops unlocked their doors. Commuters prepared for another ordinary day. Then, just after sunrise, he heard footsteps approaching. Marcus immediately looked up. A doctor stood before him, her expression calm and reassuring. For a moment, he could not breathe. He had experienced enough loss to know how much could be hidden behind a single expression. The doctor spoke gently, explaining that Amelia was improving and responding well. There would still be recovery ahead, but the uncertainty that had filled the previous day was finally beginning to lift. Marcus closed his eyes as relief washed over him. It felt almost overwhelming, like finally reaching the surface after being underwater far too long. A few hours later, he was allowed to enter the room. The morning sunlight filtered softly through partially open blinds, filling the space with warm golden light. The air smelled clean and still. Amelia rested quietly against white pillows, looking tired but peaceful. When she noticed him standing near the doorway, a faint smile appeared. It was not a dramatic moment. No music played. No grand speeches filled the room. Just two people looking at each other with the understanding that some things matter more after nearly being lost. Marcus walked to her bedside and gently took her hand. The same hand that had held coffee cups during long conversations. The same hand that had pointed excitedly toward books, gardens, and future plans. For several seconds neither spoke. Words seemed unnecessary. Amelia squeezed his hand lightly. "You look terrible," she said softly. Marcus laughed, a sound filled with relief and emotion. "That is probably fair." Her smile grew. "How long have you been here?" "Long enough to drink terrible hospital coffee." The sunlight continued brightening the room. Outside the window, the rain had stopped completely. Tiny drops still clung to the glass, sparkling beneath the morning light. Marcus looked at Amelia and realized something important. His life had never unfolded according to plan. He had lost people he loved, faced disappointments he never expected, endured seasons of loneliness that seemed endless. Yet every hardship had somehow led him to this moment. Slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket and removed the small ring box. Amelia's eyes widened immediately. Marcus shook his head and laughed nervously. This was supposed to happen differently. Tears gathered in her eyes before he had even finished speaking. "I had a whole plan," he continued. "A better location. Better timing. Definitely less hospital lighting." Amelia laughed through her tears. Marcus opened the box. The silver ring caught the sunlight, reflecting a small beam of light across the white sheets. His voice remained steady despite the emotion rising in his chest. "You helped me believe in tomorrow. Again, you helped me understand that kindness is not something you give away. It is something that grows when it is shared. You made me feel seen when I thought the world had forgotten me. Amelia Carter, will you marry me?" Tears rolled down her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Of course yes." Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger and rested his forehead gently against her hand. For a long moment, neither moved. The room remained quiet except for the distant sounds of the hospital beginning another day. Outside, sunlight spread across the city. Inside, Marcus finally understood what his mother had meant all those years ago. The world may remember loud people first, but it remembers kind people longest. And sometimes, if you are fortunate enough, kindness leads you home.